The room was cold, silent, and filled with a strange hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She stepped inside, her fingers tightening around the clipboard they had given her. The lights overhead flickered for a brief second before stabilizing. Something about this place felt wrong. She had been hired for many jobs before: private caregiving, hospital shifts, even working with high-profile patients who demanded secrecy. But this was different. The contract had been simple: provide care. Ask no questions. Speak only when necessary. The pay was more than generous, but the restrictions? Unusual. She had barely been told anything about the patient, only that he was special. Now, as she stood in front of the hospital bed, she finally saw him. A man, no, something more than a man, lay there, completely still. His skin was pale, almost too perfect, as if it had never known a single scar. His chest rose and fell in a rhythmic pattern, yet there were no monitors attached to him. No IVs, no life support. Just him, breathing in the silence. She stepped closer. His hair was dark, strands falling over his forehead like shadows. His face was sharp, symmetrical in a way that wasn't normal. And then there were his arms, half covered by the thin sheet, but enough was exposed to show a faint, glowing network of veins beneath his skin. Her heart pounded. Who was he? Before she could think further, a voice crackled through the intercom above her. Begin your duties. You have exactly 1 hour. The voice was cold. Mechanical. There was no warmth in it, no sign of a human presence behind the words. She swallowed hard, pushing her unease aside. She had a job to do. Slowly, she reached for the washcloth in the metal basin beside the bed. As she moved closer, she hesitated. Something in her gut told her that touching him would change everything. That once she made contact, there would be no turning back. But she had already accepted the job. She had already stepped into this world. So, she pressed the warm cloth against his arm. Instantly, his eyes snapped open. Her breath caught. His gaze was intense, almost inhuman. His pupils were large, adjusting rapidly to the light, and in that single moment, she knew one thing for certain. This was not just a patient. And she was not just a caregiver. She had walked into something much bigger than herself. And now, she wasn't sure if she would ever walk out. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world outside the sterile room ceased to exist. She had expected confusion, maybe even fear from him. But there was none. His gaze wasn't that of a helpless patient waking up to a stranger. It was knowing. Calculated. Observant. Then, just as quickly as they had opened, his eyes closed again. A shiver ran through her. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe it was just a reflex. Her hand was still frozen in place, the warm cloth pressed against his arm. The glowing veins beneath his skin pulsed faintly, disappearing and reappearing in a slow rhythm, like an unseen energy moved beneath his flesh. She forced herself to breathe. This was just another job. That's what she kept telling herself. She dipped the cloth back into the basin, wrung it out, and carefully resumed her work, wiping over his skin, up his arm, over his shoulder. The moment the cloth brushed against his collarbone, his fingers twitched. A reaction. She pulled back slightly, glancing at his face. His breathing was slow and controlled, almost unnaturally so. It wasn't the breathing pattern of someone unconscious. He was awake. He was aware. She leaned in slightly. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. No response. She waited, expecting something, a movement, a sound. But nothing came. A cold voice interrupted her thoughts through the intercom. "Focus on your task. Do not engage in unnecessary interaction." Her entire body stiffened. The voice was different from before. sharper. Watching her. She turned her head slightly, scanning the corners of the room. There were no visible cameras, but she knew better. She was being observed. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to continue. As she worked, her thoughts raced. Why did they need a caregiver for him? He wasn't hooked up to any machines. There were no signs of wounds, illness, or injury. No medications. No doctors coming in and out. She had worked with comatose patients before. This wasn't that. Every instinct in her screamed that this was something else entirely. She dipped the cloth into the water again and glanced at his face. Was he faking it? The thought made her skin prickle. If he was awake, why pretend to be unconscious? And why hire her? As she wiped over his chest, she hesitated again. There, just under his ribs, was something that looked like a scar. But it wasn't a scar. Not exactly. It was precise, geometric, like it had been made with a laser or a surgical tool. The skin around it was flawless, smooth, too smooth. Her fingers brushed over it lightly. In an instant, his hand shot up and grabbed her wrist. She gasped, the cloth slipping from her fingers, splashing into the basin below. His grip wasn't painful, but it was strong. His eyes opened again. This time, he didn't close them. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was deeper than she expected. Steady. Controlled. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, the intercom buzzed loudly. "Release her. Now." His grip loosened. She stumbled back, her breath shallow, her mind reeling. The voice on the intercom was different now, urgent, sharp. The man in the bed just stared at her, his expression unreadable. A moment passed. Then another. Finally, he spoke again, softer this time. "Leave. While you still can." Before she could respond, the doors behind her slammed open. Two men in dark uniforms stepped inside, their faces unreadable beneath the artificial lighting. "Step away from the subject," one of them ordered. Her body tensed. Subject. Not patient. Subject. Her chest tightened. She wasn't working for a hospital. She wasn't working for a private client. She was part of an experiment. And now, she wasn't sure if they were ever going to let her leave. The two men in dark uniforms didn't hesitate. One of them grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the bed. She didn't struggle, yet. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Step outside," the other ordered, his voice cold and firm. She looked back at the man on the bed. He didn't move. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, his unnaturally sharp, piercing eyes, were still locked on hers. He had spoken to her. "You shouldn't be here. Leave while you still can." What did that mean? What was this place? She felt the grip on her arm tighten slightly as they pulled her toward the door. Think. Think. If she acted too defiant, she might not leave this room again. But if she stayed silent, she might never find out the truth. She forced herself to speak. "I'm just doing my job." One of the men glanced at her. "Then do it without asking questions." She kept walking, her pulse hammering in her ears. The door slid shut behind her, locking the man inside once again. They led her down the corridor. The walls were smooth metal, the lighting dim and clinical. Everything about this facility screamed secrecy. Finally, they stopped in front of another door. One of the men scanned a badge, and the door hissed open. Inside was a small, sterile room. A desk. A chair. A single blinking camera in the corner. Interrogation. She swallowed hard as they guided her in. "Sit." She obeyed. One of the men stood by the door, arms crossed. The other sat across from her, fingers tapping against the desk. "Tell me exactly what happened in there." She hesitated. She had to be careful. "Nothing. I was just cleaning him, and then he grabbed my wrist. That's all." The man narrowed his eyes. "And?" She shook her head. "And nothing. He let go when you told him to." The silence stretched between them. He didn't believe her. The man leaned forward slightly. "Did he say anything to you?" Her breath caught. She could lie. But something told her they already knew the answer. "No," she said carefully. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, he leaned back in his chair. "You will continue your job. But from now on, you will follow protocol. No questions. No unnecessary interactions. Do you understand?" She forced herself to nod. "I understand." "Good." He stood, gesturing toward the door. "You're dismissed. We'll be watching." She didn't doubt that for a second. She walked back to her quarters, her mind spinning. She had worked in high-security environments before, but this was different. The secrecy. The way they called him, the subject. The warning in his voice. And most of all, his eyes. There was something human in them. Something trapped. Something that shouldn't be there. She sat on the edge of her cot, running her hands through her hair. She could walk away. Take her money, finish her contract, and never look back. Or she could figure out the truth. Her eyes drifted to the small communication device on the table. It was standard issue, only for emergencies, programmed to connect only to facility personnel. She reached for it, hesitated, then set it back down. No. Not yet. She needed answers first. Tomorrow, she would go back into that room. And this time, she wouldn't leave without knowing what he really was. She barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his. The intensity of his gaze. The warning in his voice. The way his fingers had wrapped around her wrist, not to harm her, but to make her listen. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was part of something bigger. But what? By morning, she had made up her mind. She would go back into that room. She would get answers. The facility was silent as she walked through the dim corridors, her footsteps echoing softly against the metal floors. Her badge beeped against the scanner, and the door to his room hissed open. He was still there, lying motionless, exactly as she had left him. His breathing was slow and even, his chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm. But she knew better now. He wasn't asleep. And he wasn't just a patient. She stepped forward cautiously, her heart pounding. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. No response. She picked up the washcloth, dipped it into the basin of warm water, and began wiping his arm. Silence. She moved to his shoulder. Nothing. But the moment she brushed over the faint scar under his ribs, his hand shot up again. This time, she didn't pull away. His fingers curled lightly around her wrist, but there was no pressure. No aggression. He was testing her. Waiting. Their eyes met again, and she felt the weight of something unspoken between them. Slowly, cautiously, she whispered, "Who are you?" His fingers twitched. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he spoke. "You already know." Her pulse quickened. Did she? She swallowed. "Why are you here?" His grip tightened, just slightly. Not by choice. A chill ran down her spine. They were keeping him here against his will. Before she could ask anything else, the intercom crackled to life. "Step away from the subject." She stiffened. They had been watching. Listening. The man released her wrist, his expression unreadable. She forced herself to turn, to put the cloth back into the basin. To act normal. Understood. Her voice was steady, controlled. The intercom buzzed again. Proceed with care. No further engagement. She exhaled slowly. For the rest of the session, she worked in silence. But she could feel his gaze on her. Watching. Waiting. And she knew, without a doubt, this wasn't over. That night, she sat alone in her quarters, staring at the wall. She had spent years following rules. Not asking questions. Not getting involved. But this time was different. Because this time, she wasn't looking at a stranger. She was looking at someone who wasn't supposed to exist. And somehow, deep inside, she knew, her life would never be the same again. The next morning, she was met with a strange, suffocating silence. She wasn't sure if it was the tension building inside her or the eerie quiet of the facility, but something felt wrong. She had barely slept, tossing and turning all night. Her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Who was he? Why was he here? What was his connection to this place? The more she tried to brush it off, the stronger the pull to know the truth became. She had spent her entire career following the rules, never asking questions, never getting involved. It was simple, do your job, get paid, and leave. But this place, it wasn't like the others. There were secrets here, dark ones, and she had become a part of them whether she liked it or not. The decision was clear, even if it terrified her. She had to help him escape. The moment she stepped into the room that morning, she could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her. The door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, and she saw him lying there, still as ever. But this time, there was something different. His eyes, they were open. For the first time since she had started, he was fully awake, his gaze focused on her. She froze. He didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to say it all. He knew. She was ready. "Can you hear me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze remained steady. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "I knew you'd come." Her breath caught in her throat. Are you planning to leave this place?" He didn't answer right away, but she could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Hope. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but full of an undercurrent of urgency. "I've waited for you to make a decision. Now it's time." She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but there was no time to ask. She had made up her mind. The first step was simple. She had to act like everything was normal. She would continue the routine, perform the caregiving duties, and make sure no one suspected anything. She had learned the importance of routine in this place. It was what kept the system running smoothly, what kept them all in line. But as she went through the motions, she felt the walls closing in. There was no turning back now. She had to find a way to get him out. Her heart pounded in her chest as she observed the cameras. She had memorized their placement in every room and hallway, noting the blind spots. It would be risky, but she knew the layout now. She had seen enough. The next phase was the hardest. She had to act as if nothing had changed, all while trying to keep him alive, and unnoticed. And every day that passed, the danger increased. She needed information, access to files that weren't meant for her. That night, she spent hours researching, piecing together what she could about the facility and its operations. She found little, most of the data was encrypted. But there was one thing she could access. One thing that made her heart stop. The subject's file. It was hidden behind layers of codes and locks, but she knew what to look for. She had learned how to hack security systems in her early years on the job, how to break into locked databases. It was a skill she had honed during her years as a contractor. As she carefully bypassed the last security measures, her fingers trembled. Finally, the file opened. What she read sent a chill down her spine. The name she was given, the one they all referred to him by, wasn't a name at all. It was a code. His true identity was buried under layers of false information, but the file included one key detail. He was not human. He was the result of an experiment in creating a new form of life. Her eyes widened. The more she read, the clearer it became. He was a genetically engineered being, created for some unknown purpose. The facility had been studying him, pushing him to the edge, and now, they were planning to end him. Her heart raced as she read the final line. Termination scheduled for tomorrow. Her mind raced. She didn't have much time. He wasn't just a man in a bed anymore. He was a part of something she couldn't even comprehend, something much bigger than herself. The decisions she had made, the risks she had taken, they were no longer just about her. They were about him. And if she didn't act now, she wouldn't just lose him. She'd lose herself. The clock was ticking. Her mind raced as she stared at the screen in front of her, the encrypted files still open, revealing the most terrifying truth. The man, the subject, was scheduled for termination tomorrow. She had less than 24 hours. She stood up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had to act. The door to his room slid open, and she stepped inside. He was still lying in bed, his breathing steady. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But the weight of the secret they were both carrying hung heavy in the air. She moved closer to him, her hands shaking slightly. She couldn't afford to let fear take over. "I've read the file," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "They're going to terminate you tomorrow. We have to leave now." For a moment, he didn't respond. His eyes, those piercing, knowing eyes, seemed to study her, as though he were measuring her resolve. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm yet laced with an urgency she hadn't heard before. "Then it's time." She didn't question what he meant. There was no time for questions. Time to act. She had already made the necessary preparations. Her first priority was getting him out of the facility. But that wasn't the most difficult part. The hardest task would be navigating the walls of security, the cameras, the guards, the locked doors, all the barriers meant to keep them from escaping. The surveillance system was the first obstacle. She'd studied it enough to know the security checkpoints, the patterns of the guards, and the hidden camera angles. She also knew there were blind spots, places where the cameras couldn't see, and the guards would never expect them to go. She had spent hours mapping out the facility's interior, committing every detail to memory. But now, with him awake and aware, the plan had to be executed in real time. "Get ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers once again, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough. He trusted her. And in that moment, she realized, he wasn't the only one who needed saving. She moved quickly, silently, methodically. Every step had to be precise. She had one shot at this. Her first task was to disable the camera in the room. She had come prepared with a small device, one that could interfere with the surveillance system for a brief moment. The blinking red light on the camera flickered, then went out. Next, she moved to the door. The lock was high-tech, there was no way she could open it manually. But she had learned to bypass these kinds of systems before. A few quick keystrokes on the hidden console by the wall, and the door clicked open. They moved through the facility quietly, keeping to the shadows. The hallways were eerily silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had no time to waste. They reached the first checkpoint, the hallway outside the room where the guards usually rotated in and out. She held her breath as they crouched in the dark, waiting for the guards to pass. They were moments away from crossing into an area with no blind spots, and she couldn't afford to be caught now. One of the guards turned a corner. The light above flickered, casting long shadows on the floor. Her pulse quickened. Then, just as the guard moved past, she nodded. They slipped into the gap between the walls, unnoticed. For the next 10 minutes, they moved through corridors, using every hidden passage she had memorized from her observations. Each turn, each step felt like an eternity. She could feel the eyes of the facility on them, the weight of every camera, every guard, every step they took. But somehow, they made it. They reached the central hub of the facility. The main exit. It was guarded heavily. There was no way around it, no way to sneak past. But she knew this place well enough to know that there was one entrance they hadn't accounted for. The underground escape tunnel. It was the facility's emergency route, meant to be used only for the highest level personnel in case of a breach. She had seen the entrance once, on her first day, in passing. She knew where it was. They sprinted. The guards were only a few meters away now, and the only thing standing between them and freedom was the locked door at the end of the hall. She reached for the emergency override key, swiping it across the scanner. The door hissed open. They ran. The tunnel was narrow and dimly lit, but it was their only chance. She could hear the sounds of pursuit behind them, but she didn't look back. There was no time for hesitation. They emerged into the open air, the night sky above them. The air was cool, fresh, nothing like the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the facility. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sweet taste of freedom. But even as they stepped into the night, she knew this wasn't over. The facility would be looking for them. They would never stop hunting them. And now, the real battle was about to begin. They ran through the darkened streets, the sounds of their footsteps echoing on the empty asphalt. The night was still, too still, and the further they got from the facility, the more it seemed like the world around them was holding its breath. The adrenaline was still rushing through her veins, but the quiet that followed felt surreal. They had escaped. She felt the weight of his presence beside her. He was with her. Alive. Free. For now. But she knew that for now was the key word. They had only taken the first step. The moment they stepped outside the safety of the facility, the world was going to change. They couldn't go back to their old lives. The facility had made sure of that. "We can't stop," she whispered. "They'll be looking for us by now. The moment they find out we're gone, they'll send everything after us." He nodded, his face grim, though there was something in his eyes, a flicker of hope. "The worst isn't over," he said. "But we've got time. They won't know where we're going." She didn't like the sound of that. He was always one step ahead. She had to trust him, but every part of her screamed that there was something he wasn't telling her. "I don't understand," she said, taking a deep breath. "You've been in that facility for so long. Why didn't you try to escape sooner?" He glanced at her, and his gaze softened for a moment. "You don't know the whole story," he said quietly. "I wasn't just a subject of an experiment. I was the last of a project, something they believed could change the world. They needed me to be alive, to complete something that only I could do. The facility, they had other plans, but they knew my value." Her heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just another test subject. He was the endgame. "What was the project?" she asked, barely able to form the words. He hesitated. "You're not ready to know." She shot him a look. "I'm already in too deep to walk away." He didn't argue. They walked in silence for a few moments. It was the kind of silence that made her feel as if she were holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Suddenly, he stopped. I knew it was too good to be true, he said quietly. I trusted them. I thought I was safe. She frowned, confused. What are you talking about? The expression on his face was one of realization and regret. I wasn't just a test subject, I was never meant to survive. I was built to be a weapon, a tool for them to control everything. But I wasn't the only one. There were others. Her heart sank. Others? He nodded grimly. There were more of us, other subjects. They weren't human, not really. They were all part of the same project, designed to be something more. But when the first set of tests failed, they switched tactics. They started pushing us harder, taking risks. I was supposed to fail too. Her mind raced. This wasn't just about one man escaping, this was about an entire history of experiments. I didn't think I was the last one. I thought there were others still out there, hiding in the dark. But it turns out. He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. They were all erased. She stared at him in shock. You're telling me they killed them all? They weren't just killed, he replied, his voice sharp. They were wiped from existence, erased from all records. Nothing about them remains. I was the only one who survived. And the moment they realized I had escaped, they began erasing everything again. You and I are now their only remaining loose ends. Her breath caught. He wasn't just a victim of the experiment. He was a witness to the whole thing. And now, she was in deeper than she could have ever imagined. Do you understand now? He asked, his voice low. They never wanted us to live. They wanted to control us. And now, they've set their sights on you. They're using you too, whether you realize it or not. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was part of the experiment too. The next few days blurred together. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. The facility's reach was too vast. Everywhere they went, it felt like they were being hunted, like every face they saw was somehow part of the system. The weight of his betrayal settled on her shoulders, he had known more than he had let on. But she couldn't stay angry at him. Not now. Not when they were in the same fight. They had to keep moving. And with every passing day, her sense of urgency grew. They needed answers, answers that the facility had buried too deep to uncover on their own. But how far was she willing to go? The days were running out. They had been on the move for weeks, constantly changing locations, always looking over their shoulders. Every time they thought they were safe, the shadow of the facility seemed to stretch across the horizon, chasing them no matter how far they went. The silence of the nights felt like a temporary respite from the chaos that loomed over them. Each day, they came closer to the truth, and farther from any hope of normalcy. But the truth wasn't as simple as they thought. The more they learned, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about escape. It wasn't even about survival. This was a fight for something bigger. One evening, as they sat in a cramped, dimly lit room in yet another safe house, she turned to him, her face drawn and tired. Tell me everything, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm done with the half-truths. I need to know why this started. Why we're both in this mess. He hesitated, his gaze distant. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. But then, with a sigh, he finally spoke. It started long before I was born, he said quietly. The project was never meant to create human beings. We were supposed to be the next step in evolution. They wanted to create a new breed of people, people who would be stronger, smarter, more efficient. They wanted to control them. To make them weapons. She felt her chest tighten as she listened. But why me? Why us? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his expression torn. You were chosen because you had the potential to be more than just a caregiver. You were part of the test. They didn't expect you to discover the truth, but they knew you were special. You're part of the design, just like me. Her head spun. I don't understand. How could they know? They knew, he interrupted. They engineered us to think we were just regular people, but we were built for something bigger. They made sure we'd find each other. That we'd come together. You and I are linked by the same purpose, the same programming. It's why we can't stay apart. Her mind was reeling, but she forced herself to focus. There was something she had to know. What is the purpose? What do they want us to do? He shook his head slowly, eyes darkening. It's not about what they want us to do anymore. It's about what we're going to do to them. The next day, they took a risk. They decided to go straight to the heart of the facility. They had nothing left to lose. It was a dangerous choice, but it was the only choice. If they were ever going to put an end to the experiments, they had to infiltrate the core of the operation and destroy it from within. They couldn't run forever. The facility had the resources, the people, the power to hunt them down, and they were getting closer. They had no allies. No place left to hide. Their only hope now was to strike back. The journey to the facility's main control hub was harrowing. They moved quickly and carefully, blending into the shadows and avoiding the cameras and guards that seemed to be everywhere. The plan was simple: get inside, shut down the facility's operations, and expose everything they had been hiding. But nothing was simple about it. As they reached the inner core of the building, a sickening realization settled in: they had been expected. As soon as they entered the main control room, alarms blared. Red lights flashed, and the walls seemed to close in around them. A voice echoed through the loudspeakers. You are both compromised. You will be terminated. She and the man exchanged a look. There was no more running. They had come too far. The battle that ensued was fierce, unlike anything she had ever experienced. They fought their way through corridors, taking out guards, disabling systems, and moving faster than the security could react. Every step was a step closer to the truth, and they couldn't afford to stop now. Finally, they reached the central command center, a massive, secure room filled with rows of computers, monitors, and machinery that controlled everything. The man stepped forward, his eyes scanning the monitors. This is it, he said. This is where it ends. She watched him closely as he hacked into the system. The screens flickered, and for a moment, she thought they had failed. Then, the screens went black. He turned to her, a grim smile on his face. I've done it. The facility's systems are down. But just as they thought they had won, the door slammed shut. A figure stepped into the room, blocking their only exit. The director, the one who had been pulling the strings all along. You thought you could just walk away, the director said, voice dripping with venom. You're nothing but tools, machines created to do my bidding. You don't get to decide when this ends. The man stepped forward, his face hard. I'm not your tool anymore. This ends now. The director smirked. You don't understand. You were always meant to fail. The experiments were designed for control, not freedom. Before he could finish, the man moved faster than she could react. In a blur, he disarmed the director, knocking him to the ground. The director gasped. You can't do this. You're not human. You were never meant to be anything more. The man's eyes flashed with cold fury. I'm more than you'll ever understand. With one final motion, the man activated the self-destruct sequence. The countdown began. The explosion rocked the building. The walls crumbled, and the ground shook beneath them. As they ran through the collapsing facility, she realized there was no going back. This was the end of the project, the end of everything they had known. The facility was no more. And as they emerged into the daylight, the world outside felt different. It wasn't the same as before. They had destroyed the heart of the experiment, but there were still questions. Questions they didn't have answers to. The world was different now. And they would have to figure out what came next, together. The dust settled around them, and the towering facility that had once held so many dark secrets was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. The blast had torn through the heart of the building, taking down everything, every record, every piece of research, every trace of the project they had once been part of. She stood beside him, her heart pounding, her lungs filled with the sharp, bitter air of freedom. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world outside seemed alive, vibrant, breathing, full of potential. But there was no denying the heaviness of the moment. The facility was gone. The project was finished. But the scars it had left were far from erased. They had destroyed the system that created them, but that didn't mean the world was suddenly free of its shadows. "I never thought it would end like this," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the wreckage behind them. "I thought we'd get out, yes, but I didn't think we'd be destroying everything in our path." He was silent for a long moment before answering. His expression was distant, like he was looking at something far beyond the ruined facility. "It wasn't just about destroying it," he said finally, his voice steady. "It was about giving us a choice. A choice to live." His words hung in the air, heavier than the silence around them. They had been created to follow orders, to be tools, to be broken and rebuilt for the whims of those who saw them as nothing more than experiments. But in that final act of defiance, they had claimed their freedom. As they walked away from the wreckage, they knew there were still dangers ahead. The organization might have been destroyed, but the world wasn't ready for what they had uncovered. The truth was buried deep, and the ripple effects would be felt for years. But for the first time, they had control. They had choices. Weeks passed, and they lived off the grid, staying one step ahead of anyone who might be looking for them. They had no real destination, no solid plan, but they were together. And that, for now, was enough. One evening, as they sat under the vast expanse of a sky full of stars, she turned to him, the weight of everything they had been through still sitting heavy on her shoulders. "We have a chance now, don't we?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, and for the first time since their escape, there was a hint of peace in his eyes. "Yes," he said. "We do. But we'll have to figure it out together." They had each other now, and that was all that mattered. They had faced a world that tried to tear them apart, that tried to control them. But in the end, they had done what no one expected. They had survived, and they had won. As they walked into the unknown, she realized something profound. It wasn't just about escaping the facility, it was about finding their place in the world. There was still so much left to discover. There were so many questions to be answered, but for the first time, she didn't feel like she was chasing an answer that someone else had dictated. She was choosing her own path. And with him by her side, she felt stronger than she ever had before. The final lesson was clear. Sometimes, the greatest freedom lies in the choices you make when the world expects you to follow a predetermined path. And while the facility might have controlled their past, the future was theirs to create.